Euthyphro is a dialogue in which Socrates engages with a theologian Euthyphro on the question of what is pious action. Piety in this case, with reference to the Greek gods, represents the way in which we should relate to the divine and its communication with us, if we're Greek that is. This is essentially the question of the GHE and the GHE to HE. While the religious details may seem rather unimportant to our modern understanding, the metaphysical importance is absolutely critical for creating and maintaining a society. The idea of piety here will influence every other key term used by the Greeks to establish their societies. These elements give us ethics, they give us the shape of society we want to bring about, they give us the blueprint for the development of that society and culture. This is the case because the gods of Homer are supposed to provide the meaning of all those other elements, but piety is all about the relation of humans to gods, and thus to all the ideas that the gods have. The dialogue centers around defining the notion of piety, but Socrates is not interested in knowing whether this or that act is pious. He wants the underlying principle that will tell him the rules of understanding piety in all cases. Euthyphro, on the other hand, keeps using the kinds of definitions that are offered by Homer. The problem is, those definitions look great until you start examining their implications. For example, the idea that what is pious is what is dear to gods falls flat on its face pretty quickly. For starters, the Greek gods don't agree on what is dear to them. These same gods are actively at war with one another, they're always fighting, they support opposite causes, and what is dear to one god is reviled by another. Case in point, Zeus had a thing about sleeping around, in that he did it all the time. So if Zeus shows up at your house and asks you to do what is dear to him, you make Zeus happy. That seems like pious action, right? Well, not really, because Zeus's wife Hera finds that kind of behavior abhorrent and will try to murder you a lot. See the problem? The definition might work if the Greeks had one god, or if their gods were in harmony, but as it is, the dear to gods definition of piety is broken. Another standard answer by Euthyphro is that piety is prayer and offering sacrifices, but that definition is all about begging for things and giving things to gods, and Socrates tears that apart right quick too. The most quoted line is of course the one where Socrates narrows in on the problems of these definitions by asking Euthyphro to provide a clear distinction. Is the good loved by the gods because it is good, or is it good because it is loved? And this is a bit complex in phrasing, so let's break it down. If good is defined as what gods love, then there are only two options available. In one case, the gods recognize the goodness of a thing and that's why they love it. If this is the case, then the idea of goodness is not part of the gods and it is not defined by the gods. Instead, it is something that gods recognize as existing out there in the world. And if that's the case, then obedience to gods makes no difference for us humans, because if they can recognize this external value, so can we. That is, you can do the same job as the gods by simply learning what is good. In the other case, whatever gods happen to love is considered to be good because they love it. So if today Zeus loves saving kittens, then saving kittens is good. But if tomorrow Zeus changes his mind and decides that he thinks that punting kittens is good, then you need to start punting kittens. In a more practical example, if Zeus wants you to go to war with some group of people today, then you should, if you want to be good, that is. But if tomorrow he decides that you should be crucified for having attacked that group of people, then that's good too. This becomes wildly inconsistent, and because the Greek idea of gods was so human, or rather worse than human, this presented a real problem to the Greeks. This also presents a problem for any kind of a stable, metaphysical, or ethical structure. If you don't have a concrete bedrock principle from which you build your ethics, then you can't build or maintain a society. This seems to be the big idea that Socrates is pushing here. Ultimately, if the concept of the gods is confused, if the GHE is confused that is, then the rules must be confused too, the GHE to HE. If the descriptive elements are confused, you can't figure out anything about the normative rules because you derive them from the descriptive ones. The Apology is a sort of demonstration of the attempts of Socrates to get his fellow Athenians to actually realize that their society needs fixing. Socrates primarily harps on the idea that he's done nothing wrong because all he does is ask questions, and nowhere does he claim to know the answer. If the famous people are left flustered and unable to answer him, that's a problem of their ignorance, not of Socrates being malicious. If they had coherent answers, the role of Socrates would be of an ignorant person learning coherent answers from well-educated people. Moreover, the fact that the learned people don't have the answers should be the worrisome part, not the fact that they got exposed. Interestingly, the idea of Socrates as a midwife is more than a little paradoxical. A midwife delivers children. Let's say that Socrates assists in the delivery of ideas, of their birthing process. This role makes sense when we're dealing with new ideas which need to be born. But Socrates is famously asking questions about topics where the Athenians, and the Greeks in general, have already established the foundations by building on top of Homer. There should be no birthing possible when you have a fully grown idea. You give birth to babies, not grown adults. But as Socrates has shown us, the supposedly grown ideas of the Athenians are just artificial constructs they were pretending are working. They were pretending worked. Once he begins asking questions, it is clear that there is no actual foundation in place. There is no adult walking about that we can point to. Instead, there is only an illusion of such developed ideas, and this is why Socrates acts as a midwife. He can act as a midwife because, by asking questions that challenge the false narrative of the Athenians, what he is doing is forcing them to give birth to new, actually functional ideas that will replace the Homeric explanation. Crito is an interesting dialogue because it focuses almost exclusively on the idea of teleology of humans. Socrates spends the whole time harping on two connected ideas, the telos of reason and the telos of human society. The purpose of a human being is reason, and that means that rejecting the rules and regulations of reason just to survive is a subpar and subhuman option. Socrates argues that what matters is not life itself, but the good life. When we couple this with the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, as well as reason as the telos for humanity, we see the kind of stress that Socrates is putting on this point. Crito's escape plan is based on the emotional desire to survive, but that is an emotional reaction. A reasoned response by Socrates pushes the emotional ideas aside and calmly examines the implications of such an action. To escape is to betray the direction of Socrates' life in pursuing the truth, if he simply runs away after giving his word that he would abide by the ruling. On the other hand, the role of society and the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen of a society are all about the telos of social organization. Here we see Socrates arguing that society must take precedence over the desire of an individual, that to use the resources and benefits of a society only to turn away when it judges you to be dangerous to its own survival is not merely cowardly, it is an attack against the social structure that supports life and has supported your own survival for all these years. Just as it would diminish Socrates to act on emotion instead of reason, it would diminish him to disregard the teleological social function of Athens. The fact that so many people do bribe their way out of jail and punishment is proof enough that the Athenian society is in danger of falling apart. Socrates refuses to degrade himself to a status of a mere cornered animal and react in a way that furthers the harm already endured by Athens. The choice to remain and to suffer the death sentence is Socrates actually acting out the HE to HE relation. The fact that Athenians escape and bribe their way to freedom means that they're not taking the GHE to HE values seriously. Thus, the HE to HE relation is also broken. Instead of being characterized by rights and responsibilities, the Athenians have become characterized by their power, wealth, and irresponsibility in a way that allows them to skirt the laws that make Athens possible. Phaedo, or rather the excerpt we read, is focused on answering the question, how should humans relate to the nature of humanity, specifically the inevitability of death? For Socrates, the answer is by realization of the inevitability of that death, and then by understanding that the position of the soul of man after death depends on their realization of their human telos. That is, since we're rational and social beings, our position in the afterlife depends on the degree to which we pursue truth in life. You can think of it this way. You will spend your afterlife doing the same kinds of things you did in life. If you were focused on material possessions in your life, then your afterlife, where you are now a disembodied spirit, will be a hell, because spirits can't interact with material objects. But you have locked your soul into a kind of habit where all it can see and pursue are material objects, and now you will spend an eternity chasing the kinds of things that you can never catch. Thus you will never be satisfied. If you were focused on reason and truth, then your afterlife will be spent pursuing the same kinds of things as a spirit, except that ideas, abstractions, and the truth are not material objects to begin with. That means that your spirit will be able to develop and will be happy. These ideas are directly part of the telos of humanity, and so Socrates is pushing the idea of focusing on that telos as a means of dealing most effectively with both this life and whatever comes after. The fact that the Athenians had lost sight of this means that the basis on which they understand themselves and society has started to come undone. They are no longer properly relating themselves to the gods or whatever it is that they have at the top of their hierarchy. And so the HE to GHE, which is man relating back to God, is broken.